I'm really happy to be here today with Alastair Duckworth. Am I pronouncing that right, Alastair?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. And Alastair contacted me via email and wanted to talk to me about his ideas. And I'm really glad he did because he's a graphic designer. So I'm always interested in the design aspect of things. But Alastair's also working on a book, and he sent me the first 4 chapters, and they're just very compelling and filled with ideas that I love. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk about this, Alastair. And I wonder if you could give us just maybe the elevator pitch of what your book is about, and then kind of go back and talk about your life a little bit and how you ended up here where you're interested in these kinds of things.
Yeah. So the title of the book is The Golden Extremes, and that's a play on Aristotle's golden mean. And the premise of the book is that to live a good life, to achieve quality or excellence, or to be creative, what you have to do is not try and avoid opposing or extreme positions. You have to embrace both of them at the same time. The golden extremes is, well, it's a number of things. So it's kind of it's also an initiative to help individuals and organizations to maximize the good that they do by embracing polarized ideas and values. The same principle goes by a few names. So some people know it as the coincidence of opposites. So anyone who's followed Ian McGilchrist's work, he uses that term. Some people call the same thing non-duality, which is a term I have a bit of trouble with, because it suggests that you are trying to avoid opposites. You're trying to only have unity rather than unity and diversity. Whereas within the book particularly, I go into how you want to have both those things. You want to have the duality and the unity at the same time. Mm-hmm. In terms of, so that's the title of the book. The elevator pitch would be, it's been a number of things. At the moment, it's probably an antidote to the dangerous doctrine of moderation, because I think that moderation is a very dangerous thing. It sounds good, but in practice, it causes a lot of problems. And so I'm trying to push into a positive form of extremism, a positive form of polarization, which I think is the only solution to what we tend to call extremism, what we tend to call polarization. So that's a nutshell.
Okay, yeah. So that's enough as a teaser. Now, where did you grow up? How did you grow up? What was interesting to you as a child? What was drawing you forward?
Wow. So I've grown up in London. I've been a Londoner all of my life, apart from London, England. I've been in London all of my life, apart from a brief escape to university, where I didn't go very far away. I went to about 30 miles out to the countryside for a few years and then came back again. I've grown up in a religious family, a Christian family. We've been churchgoers, or we were churchgoers all of my childhood. I've been in a lot of different types of churches, so charismatic, conservative, Pentecostal, Church of England, a lot of different places. As you said, I'm a designer. That's mainly because at school the only thing I was particularly good at was art, and so that made my career trajectory rather simple: either be an artist or a designer, or something in the creative industries. And so that as I realized that being an artist is financially quite a challenging decision, design seemed a good, sensible way to go. So having finished school, went to art college, studied graphic design for 3 years or 4 years, including a foundation course, which is something we do here, and then have been in the design industry ever since, which is now just over 20 years. Feels to me quite a long time.
Well, that's about the same time when I started thinking about this whole issue of how the principles of design weave into every aspect of the universe.
Yep.
And you can spend your whole life contemplating that. I mean, it's like, it's just so fascinating. And I love your book, the way you have simplified these concepts enough to put them into kind of a, make them little nuggets that a person can carry around with them, but you've still kept the depth of what's underneath them. And to me, that's amazing, because some of these ideas are so big in my head that I can't find a way to articulate them, which is why I've got 350 episodes trying to put it into words. And you
Well,
did all that in, I don't know, the 4 chapters are what, 50, 60 pages.
I mean, that's extremely generous of you.
There's one aspect that is not in your book, so it still leaves an opportunity for me to add something, but
Oh, there's many things that aren't in the book. I think from being a designer, my job is to take complex ideas or fairly complex ideas and make them as immediately accessible as possible. And so for me, the pleasure of the writing, or it's also the pain of the writing, but the pleasure of the exercise is to try and take something that's as deep as I can possibly get it, and then make it as accessible as I possibly can. And so, and it's holding that tension that's real. That's the pleasure for me. So if I can create a diagram or a paragraph that really gets to the heart of something, I'm not particularly good at telling a story. I'm not very good at working with narrative, but I can get a complicated idea and make it simple fairly well. And so that's been the sort of driving force. How can I take this very nebulous concept, which to me seems so important, and then make it so that someone who's got no idea about the subject will be able to pick it up and get it fairly quickly. So that's,
well, so
it's been a pleasure, but also, go on.
I was going to say, when I started the book, I noticed that you have a lot of wonderful quotes in there, but you mentioned that it was something that G.K. Chesterton said that really stirred you to start
Yes.
writing this book.
Yeah.
So would you like to talk about that a little bit?
So, so when I was at university, there were two things that I was trying to get my head around. I was a young Christian, and I was just at the very beginning of my design life, and I was trying to work out the two questions I was trying to get to the bottom of was firstly, is there a formula for good design? And then the second thing was, is there a pattern to profound religious experience? And these seem to be two very different questions, very different areas. And I came to the conclusion that yes, there was an answer to both those things. But then the thing that really surprised me was that the answer seemed to be the same in both contexts. And so, and that answer was paradox. And so, in the design realm, any good or any compelling piece of visual communication, anything that really grabs your attention, will do so because it has a clash of ideas. It brings together two things that you wouldn't expect to go together, but it's not just arbitrary, and it doesn't just, you don't go away feeling cheated. You discover that those ideas do actually fit somehow, and that new fitting together sort of raises your consciousness. It sort of shifts your paradigm, and you go away sort of slightly enlightened by that experience. And so that's in design. But then in on the religious front, I remember having a conversation with a friend who said to me, we were talking about Christian faith, and he said, he asked me what it was I found most compelling about Christianity. And the answer I gave, which actually was a surprise to me at the time, I wasn't expecting to say it, was that it was the irrational aspect of Christianity that I found most interesting. And not by that I didn't mean nonsensical. I meant where two things, again, the paradox situation, where two things seem like they couldn't go, they shouldn't go, and yet somehow they did. And that and I didn't know how to articulate that at the time, so I was kind of confused as to why that came out of me. And so, yeah. Sorry, remind me of your question. I've slightly.
Oh no, you're answering the question. Yeah, you're answering the question. G.K. Chesterton,
G.K.
you
Chesterton.
stumbled on this quote from
Yes.
G.K. Chesterton, and that motivated you to write the book.
Yes. So he wrote an autobiography called Orthodoxy, which many people will know. And in that book, there is a chapter called The Paradoxes of Christianity. And within that, he looks at how Christianity just seems to be so odd, and Christ in particular seems to be so odd. And as he goes through the chapter, he shows that everybody seems to have a problem with Christ. Everybody seems to have a problem with Christianity. Those on the left of politics find it to be too right wing. Those on the right find it to be too left wing. And then he comes to the conclusion that, well, maybe it's not Christ or Christianity that's in the wrong. It's that other people or have got the wrong end of the stick, but have done so in opposite ways. And so it's actually that Christ is both left and right wing at the same time. And so those who are left, to them, he'll seem too right wing. But it's not because he's off balance. It's just that they're off balance in the opposite way. And it was here that I first came across where he compares, although he doesn't speak of Aristotle directly, he speaks of Aristotle's golden mean here, or he speaks of pagan ideas of balance within virtue, and he's very much pointing towards Aristotle's golden mean, which is where I then later compared Aristotle and Chesterton's ideas to create the concept, or just to name the concept as the golden extremes. But that really, Chesterton and then Pascal really got me thinking. Pascal's brilliantly paradoxical thinker. He seems to realize that the heart is more important than the head, and the heart has its reasons that reason doesn't understand. And so the two of them really got me interested in sort of trying to get to the bottom of this form of faith or form of Christianity, which I hadn't really come across before.
One of the fascinating things about the book is it's not set up as a Christian explanation at all.
No.
In fact, the quote from G.K. Chesterton is probably one of the only things in there that would have indicated to me that you were a person of faith, but you're still laying out all these truths in a way that anybody could come along and pick up these breadcrumbs and come to a gigantic kind of epiphany, I think, about many of these issues. So the quote from G.K. Chesterton, because I just read it this morning, so it's fresh in my mind. I can't say the exact quote, but he's talking about the polar opposite of the polar opposites that relate to courage in battle.
Yes.
And
got it here somewhere. Bear with me.
It made me think of several things, and it's this idea of polar opposites of wanting to honor both extremes.
Yes.
Is if you think of a guitar string, it's pulled taut at both ends, and that's what allows it to be a guitar string. That's what allows it to make music. There's no music in a guitar string if you let go of one end. I mean, it would be like playing tug of war with a guitar string. You're not going to get anything out of it, right? But then I also thought about musical instruments, like wind instruments, how you blow air in one end and the air comes out the other end, but the air coming out the other end is entirely different than the air that went in. And so you have these polar opposites, but what happens in the middle is this convoluted movement and form that is there that's adding to the expression. And so I wonder if there isn't some of that in this whole issue of polar opposites too.
So go on.
I know that you said you were interested in the conversation that I had with Peter Beckman about Guardini's comment that if we mistake polarity for contradiction, we're going to run into major trouble.
Yes, I've got a slightly different take on that. Because from memory, Guardini says that, or examples of contradictions were good and evil, being and non-being, yes and no, and those were simply, it was simply kind of a zero-sum game between those two. So you can't have yes and no; they just simply cancel each other out, or one annihilates the other. I find McGilchrist more compelling on this, where he describes good and evil as having a kind of reciprocal relationship, and same with being and non-being, I think. Where
well, the thing that McGilchrist said on my channel when we were talking about this was that evil cannot consume good.
Yes.
but good can consume evil and transform it.
Yes.
And I thought that was a tremendous way of looking at it, because it's not like if I think of a polarity, if I think of a, I forget what they used to call these in school when they'd set up these two values on the board, then they put a string in between them, and you're supposed to pick someplace on the string.
Spectrum.
Spectrum, yes. If you have a
Yeah.
spectrum between good and evil, the minute you step off of the good side, it's now corrupted by some of that evil,
Yeah.
is the picture that you get. But if you think of the tension there, and that good has the purpose of redeeming evil, then good can almost be like Pac-Man, you know, consuming and transforming the evil as it goes, and
Yeah.
not lose the I mean, the way it works in our lives, I think, is that we get stumbled by things, and we end up on paths where we face obstacles, or we face our own inner darkness as an obstacle, and our lives get transformed little by little. And if we're allowing the redemption of those errors and those mistakes to change us, to transform us into something better,
Yeah.
into good, then all of those obstacles and problems all contributed to the final result in a way that is very mysterious. And so you have to have both ends there somehow.
Well, yeah, and that's why I found the idea of good and evil simply contradict each other. It doesn't quite sit with me, um, because it seems that in biblical stories you have God using evil for good. If you think of a great story, often a great story, I think there's a quote by Hitchcock that's something along the lines that a story is as good as its villain. And so to have a really good story on a sort of that has a moral problem at the heart of it, you have to have good and evil fighting each other. And so you need those two in order for the overall story, sort of a level up, to be good. And I think that happens in lots of situations. That in order, I think the breakdown of the polarity of good and evil leads to evil, leads to the ultimate evil, whereas the coming together of those two in a sort of reciprocal relationship leads to an ultimate good. And one of the things that Mick Gilchrist really helped clear up for me on this was that they're not balanced. Good is ever so slightly in eternity, in the infinite. Good is greater than evil, and that means that you can head towards the good as your goal, but all the while incorporating evil in the appropriate way, in order to achieve that greater good. And it seems you're sort of always on this sort of oscillation upwards, or spiral, or whatever it might be. But yeah,
It
no,
really
that
is a
really,
paradox. I mean, when you were talking just there, the picture that popped into my head is a picture from the movie Mission, The Mission.
I know it. I've not seen it.
Oh, okay. Well, it's about these missionaries that go to someplace in South America, I think, and they face all sorts of terrible, brutal experiences, and they discover all sorts of things about themselves. And it's a very hard movie to watch. But one of the scenes, one of the guys is very aware of all the garbage that he carries around in himself. And
Mm-mm.
so I might have the story wrong. I just have the
I
picture in
won't be
my
able to.
head.
I won't
He's
correct you.
he's he's trying to climb up a mountain, and he's got this big heavy bag of weights on his back, all
Yeah,
kinds
yeah,
of trash and garbage in this big bag, and it's very, very heavy. And he's trying to climb up the mountain, and he he could make a lot more progress if he would just cut that thing off, right?
yeah, yeah.
But he keeps struggling all the way up to the top of the mountain with this weight on his back. And I don't even remember what happens. I don't remember the end of the story. I'm just thinking about that weight,
Yeah.
um, as even people who are trying to work towards fitness, they will bind themselves with a weight like that in order to increase their fitness, increase their endurance level, and all of that. And so
Yeah.
there's something in there. I mean, I think we're supposed to cut loose all our garbage. There's a verse in Hebrews about the weight that so entangles, you know,
Mm-mm.
break off the chain of the weight that so entangles. But even if we're not able to do that, the weight does its work.
Mm-mm. Yes. And this is a work, this is a thought in progress. So I'm not sure if I'm committed to it, but I do wonder whether, when it comes to evil, um, you have to have it in your life somehow. If you try and just avoid it completely, it will manifest in some way that you don't want. Um, Whereas if you're trying to if you're trying to achieve good by tackling evil, it seems that then it has its place, but then you're doing something about it to try and transcend it. Whereas if you just run away from it, if you try and make your life perfect and avoid any problems and get away from that, then it ends up coming to get you in ways that you're not expecting. I suppose I think of if a child is raised in a very comfortable and situation where there are no challenges and the parent looks after them in every possible way, then and perhaps spoils the child, then problems will arise because they haven't been tackling the difficulty that exists in life, which could on one level be described in terms of evil. Um, so a thought in progress, but something I've wondered about.
Well, it kind of takes us back to the G.K. Chesterton quote that courage only show. Well, I remember C.S. Lewis saying something to the effect that every virtue is courage at the sticking point,
Yes.
and courage can only show itself in the face of something that requires courage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, and that's probably true of all the virtues. They can really only show themselves in the face of the opposite.
Yes.
It's like
And
in a work of art, the positive image can only be recognized because of the negative space around it.
yes. Yes. Well, I suppose you've got two, haven't you? You've got the clash between the courageous person and the difficult situation, and then they've also got to Chesterton's point, they've got to be trying to self-preserve and also put themselves in a dangerous situation at once.
Mm-hmm.
And so he calls courage a contradiction in terms and describes how if you're a soldier, you always got to put yourself in danger, but you're doing so in order to protect yourself. And if you go one way or another, then you're lost.
Mm-hmm.
If you're reckless, you're gone, and if you're cowardly, well, then that's not going to work out for you either. Um, and this is where it was great having Aristotle to compare to. Um, and I so when I was in the first chapter of the book where I'm looking at this more sort of extremes form of courage versus Aristotle's mean, um, I was worrying again and again that I was misreading Aristotle, and it's possible I still am, because I thought, well, Chesterton seems so right about this, and Aristotle's right about so many things that surely he's saying the same thing. But it does seem, going over Aristotle, I've gone over him a number of times over the passages in his Nicomachean Ethics, and he is saying that you're trying to avoid these extremes, go to the middle. You don't want to have one is an excess and the other is a deficiency, but the right action is taking that middle intermediate road. Um, and it just, I think, when you do that, you end up. You've probably seen one of the videos I've sent you. You end up not at a place where you've got balance ultimately, but you have a place where you just have neither of these two. You're not trying to self-preserve, and you're also not trying to take risk. You're just trying to avoid either of those. And the mean to me seems like a kind of philosophy of avoidance, whereas taking the extreme seems to be embracing both things as if they're virtues, and they become virtues when they're in relationship with each other. And then when they do that, they're incredibly generative of life and energy and vitality. And that's also where, in, say, a political situation where you think, I don't want to be extreme left or extreme right, and so therefore I'll go for the moderate middle. It puts you in a very precarious situation because you have no strength to push back against the dangerous extremes. Whereas if you're holding on to both at the same time, because they energize each other, it gives you a position of strength and position of power in order to push back on corruptions of going singly too far in any direction. So I found that particularly interesting, the comparison of Chesterton and Aristotle.
So I think what you're talking about is finding the best aspects of both ends of the extreme.
Yes.
Because when Peterson talks about the masculine and the feminine, archetypes, masculine and feminine archetypes, on the feminine side, there's a definite negative in being too compassionate, too nurturing, not allowing the child to be exposed to anything, and wanting to keep the child so close that they never develop. And so there's that whole negative. But then there's the positive side of being nurturing and caring and imparting love and helping the child to grow and learn. And then on the other side, there's the tyrannical father who has so many rules that everything becomes absolutely rigid and no movement at all. But on the other side, there's the benevolent father who understands how to lead and understands how to challenge. And so you have two extremes, and this happens in a marriage where you have these extremes, and you have these extremes of thought in each person.
Yeah.
I mean, I can definitely see the monster mother in myself, and then I can see the other side of me that, you know, really loves my children in a good and positive and growing way.
Yeah.
And I can see the two extremes in my husband. But what happens in marriage is that when those two are coming together in disagreement,
yeah,
there has to be some meta level that helps you work out those two things. And
yes,
I mean, in a marriage, you can have God at the center, so that you have a triangle, and God is up here. So as each of you grows closer to God, you get closer to each other, helps you work out some of those things. But even if a couple doesn't have God involved, as long as they're committed to each other, they're not going to divorce. That commitment in and of itself will force you to work through those problems in a way that takes it a level up. So you have a perspective that allows it to become more than it otherwise would be.
Well, there's something very interesting in that, which is that if we go back to courage, so self-preservation as a pole by itself simply degrades into cowardice. And if you have sort of taking necessary risk on its own, it degrades into recklessness. And so the poles find their own existence by being in relationship with the opposite. And so once they're in that relationship, then they're taken to a higher level of being. And I think that's the same in any polar situation. And so I think with the masculine and the feminine, the masculine finds its health and its true masculinity in relation to the feminine, and vice versa. And I think you can. So there's always a healthy in relationship form of a pole, and then a degraded, collapsed, separate, isolated form of a pole. And it's interesting that if going back with the golden mean, if self-preservation loses its relationship with its opposite, then it becomes Aristotle's vice of cowardice. And in the same way, necessary risk, if it loses its relationship with its opposite, it collapses into Aristotle's vice of cowardice. And so it's interesting that he is avoiding two negative things, which actually, when in relationship, become positives. And so when in your example of the husband and wife, I think that I think we're so used to seeing things in a kind of single-minded way, where it's an either-or situation, where it's either you or it's me, and so and it's kind of zero-sum way. So if you get what you want, then I will miss out on what I want. But actually, if you when you realise that whole contains the two parts, then in order to get what you really want, then you have to incorporate the opposite. Or in order to be who you really are, then you incorporate the opposite. And then actually both you become what you really are through that. And both of you transcend as you do. But that involves being able to see both opposites as right at the same time. And I think that we fundamentally, I don't know whether it's a modernist thing or a rational thing, or just a left brain issue that we have, but we tend to be so single-minded about these issues that it's got to be that. It's got to be that or in the middle. It can't be both at the same time. And that causes all kinds of problems for us all the time.
Yeah, I'm sure that some people listening to us will misunderstand what we're trying to say about the place of evil. And we could spend the whole rest of this episode just talking about that.
Yeah. I'm not endorsing evil. I'm not saying
yes,
don't be evil.
And the thing is, I mean, I get a daily little article from Ryan Holiday about Stoicism, and today it was about Epictetus. And Epictetus started life as a slave, and his father was a very positive, not a positive thinker, not that kind of thing. But I mean, his father always said, the only one that can defeat you is you and your attitude. And if you look at everything that arises as an opportunity, as a gift, then it changes the way that you're going to approach living within that moment. Yeah. And even though his father was a slave until he died, he felt like he had a good life because he lived each moment with that viewpoint of this also is good. This also is good. And so it's not a matter of saying evil is that we accept evil or that we think evil is good. It's just in context, the evil things that come to us can be transformed into good if we attend to them in the right way.
Well, I think of is it Paul saying that all things work together for good for those who love God? And if you would put that in Petersonian terms, if you aim at the highest good, then everything that comes to you is a blessing. And I think it's that sort of thing. And so, to your point, I'm not. The evil is transcended; it's turned into something better. And that's where I feel that it has to be, to some degree, some sort of polar relationship. Otherwise, that couldn't happen. I think if they simply contradicted each other, then you wouldn't be able to have that redeeming of the evil into something good. But I think in John, is it that God is light and in him there is no darkness? I think in the infinite, in the ultimate situation, that is the case. And that is because I think that all these evil will ultimately be transformed to good.
Well, Joseph's life jumps into my mind right now. I mean, the whole timeline of Joseph's life is filled with all sorts of evil things that happened to him. And yet, in the final event, it's all beautiful. It's just beautiful. It's like it was one gift after another that saved a nation, saved two nations. And I think what happens to us is we get stuck in our own timeline and we think, it's this moment here that matters. But like the polar opposites, that we don't know how long that string is, and we don't know how it moves through time or what effect that the tension of that string is going to have on the next generation or 15 generations in the future.
Well, the wonderful situation we got with Joseph is that we can look back on it and see how it worked out, whereas we don't have that. We don't have that for ourselves.
Yeah, and Joseph in the moment couldn't do that either.
He wasn't having a great time. But I suppose in real time, if you to what you were saying before, if you're making the most of every moment, if you're aiming at the highest good in every situation, then it will work out the best it can be. Or and then when looking back, you might have that situation in a small way like Joseph did. I mean, I'd love to be able to know in advance how things are going to work out, so as to be able to relax a bit.
Yes, but that's the whole thing. If you did relax, then it wouldn't, whatever it was going to happen won't happen, because a guitar string that is loose on one end is just flapping in the breeze.
Yeah.
So let's move on to chapter 2. You start out chapter 2 with a differentiation between shallow truths and profound truths. And I thought that was very interesting kind of breakdown.
Well, so I've had a quick, I just had a quick back look over it now, and the beginning of the chapter is looking at how polarity relates to the transcendentals. So the idea is that ultimately reality is composed of, or is in some way true, good, and beautiful, and that all of these things relate to each other. And so anything that's true is also good, is also beautiful, and that doesn't mean that they don't get sort of mixed up at the same time. And so you'll have anyone can think of situations where something that's beautiful is not good. But I think that what's going on there is that reality is complicated, and so it exists on a number of different levels. And so you can have something that's ugly and something that's good butted up against each other. Like you can think of someone who's beautiful in appearance, but their character is not very good. But at the same time, in terms of their appearance, if they're beautiful, then their appearance is also good, is also true. I think Chesterton says that if a man can shoot his grandmother at 100 yards, he's a good shot, but not necessarily a good man. And so, although these things get mixed up together, ultimately anything that's true is also good, is also beautiful. But then the thing that surprised me, that I found really interesting, is that each of those things can be understood in terms of opposites coming together. And so I think I mentioned Niels Bohr, and that on the saying that to what you just said, that there are shallow truths, and the opposite of a shallow truth is simply a falsehood. So if a fact is true, then its opposite will be false. But at the same time, when you get to deeper truths, such as the relationship between love and justice, or good and evil, or any of these things, you find out that it's actually two things can be true at the same time to some degree. Now then, that works down the hierarchy. So if you because anything that's true works itself out in the world as good, and then the experience of that will be beautiful. If you've got polar truths at the top end with truth, then when they work themselves out in the world, then in a dynamic sense, the goodness will be the coming together of those opposite truths in a situation. And then when we experience that through the senses, that will be beautiful. But what will that beauty be? It will be the coming together again of these opposites, the experience of these opposing things. And so, I mean, my mind always goes to branding for this sort of thing, because that's where I work, and brands can often be very good examples of this sort of thing. So a brand like Airbnb, this is my favorite Polarity brand. Their slogan is "Belong Anywhere," and you think, well, that doesn't make sense. You can't belong if you're anywhere, and if you're anywhere, you don't belong. And yet that somehow they've created the infrastructure, or they've created the technological platform in order to make that happen to some degree. And so you can go on holiday, you can find yourself, you can go to a very unusual place and still feel to some degree at home. You might stay with a host. They might tell you what's in the local area. They might introduce you to certain things. And so in some small way, they provided a bit of belonging in your going anywhere. And so at the top of the tree, in the sort of truth section, you've got those two truths. In the goodness section, you've got the putting that into practice. They're providing, as a brand or as a business, they are providing what's required in order for those truths to be put into action in your life as the customer. And then the experience of that whole thing is a form of aesthetic experience of meaning, something again through the senses, but it's an experience of the good, which is the beautiful. And so, and well, we might get onto this in a bit, or we'll leave it for another time. But I've worked over the last sort of 5-10 years to try and make a way of conceiving of business and brands in terms of sort of archetypal truths that are then put into practice. And then when they're put into practice, the experience of that for the customer is something beautiful. Try and move our thinking about business and brands away from just materialistic to meaning. But to come back to what you were saying about what's covered in the second chapter of this book, it's how the relationship between the true, the good, and the beautiful, and then how you put that into practice in a creative process.
Well, when you were talking, it just came into my mind a quote from a book that I've been reading by David Bohm, the physicist who was a contemporary of all those guys in the mid-20th century.
Yes.
He wrote a book called, well, I don't think he wrote this. I think his those who inherited all his papers put this together after he died, because it was published in 1995, and I don't think David Bohm was still alive then. I could be wrong, but the book is called On Creativity, and it's all of his ideas about art. And in there, he's talking about goodness, and he said, in his mind, the etymology of goodness is to gather. And so the whole idea of beauty is to gather things in such a way that they fit. And so goodness and beauty fit together that way. And I thought, that's pretty interesting, because in all the explorations that I've been doing, I keep coming up against this idea of fittedness, how important measurement is in physics, in everything, how important measurement is, and fittedness is really what, well, I don't think you can take it apart. Fittedness is what makes things work together, but things work together because they're fitted. I mean, it's you have to have both at the same time, and it's when an artist is, when I'm trying to paint a painting, I'm working for this thing where every stroke fits the whole, so that there's this. Later on, you talk about multiplicity and unity, and that all of the strokes that are in a painting just disappear. When you look at the painting, you're only seeing the whole, but all those pieces had to be fitted into the context, each of them for a purpose. And all those purposes are, well, of course, I get on this hobby horse all the time, but unity, harmony, contrast, dominance. And we can talk about that dominance. That's why the mean doesn't work, because there has to be dominance to provide unity. Without dominance, there could be no unity. And then repetition, variation, gradation, and balance.
I remember I looked for it. There was an episode you did, well, I think with another artist, where you held up a piece of paper and you had the polarities in lines.
I was trying to do some sort of a visual representation of it, but
I've ended up doing the same thing.
But it's impossible.
It's no, absolutely to your point.
I recently saw some visuals. Where was I looking at this? Some video I was watching this morning, and they had some visuals of not straight lines like that, but many, many curved lines, and almost like a big bowl of spaghetti. That's the way they say a woman's brain looks, by the way. It's like spaghetti, because there's so many connections. Everything connects. Supposedly men's brains are more like a set of boxes where everything has its own place, but a woman's brain is like all these connections. And anyway, enough of that. Here's a quote from chapter 2. A helpful way to think about these deeper truths or ideas is as creative energies or patterns. I thought that was terrific. That these deeper truths are creative energies or patterns. And you go on to say that there's two forces of one power, dynamic marriages that give rise to new things.
So the two forces of one power, that's from the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he was a very interesting guy. He's someone who's been very important to me. But he was trying to bring together science, art, philosophy, theology, and at the bottom, at the foundation for all his sort of streams of thinking was polar opposites. And he described them as the two forces of one power. And so they were opposite forces, one kind of expanding outwards, the other one coming in. And it's through that creates the tension, but also that creates the unity, which creates the fittingness, because it's that overall coming together as one power that pulls all the fitted parts into relationship with each other.
So he said that expanding out and pulling in.
He describes them as centripetal and centrifugal, which
Because
is really interesting.
David Bohm talks about that in his whole physics thing about the explicit and the implicate order, and the implicate order is the enfolded. Everything is enfolded up inside and then unfolding outwards.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that seems to have parallels with Persig's static and dynamic quality.
Yes. I've had. Have you ever talked to Sibylla King?
I've not talked to her, but I've watched some of the episodes between you two.
Yeah, we tried to dig down to the bottom of that, but there does seem to be a lot there with this whole idea of quality being that which draws.
Yes. Coleridge uses two, I think they're medieval expressions for nature. He calls it natura naturans and natura naturata, and one is again the sort of enfolded dynamic life of nature, and the other one is the material expression that it produces. And so to go back to what you were saying about ideas being these dynamic energies, and I think of McGilchrist saying that there's a left and right brain interpretation of everything in the world, and so often we think of ideas as concepts, as sort of abstract static things that are in the left brain, whereas living ideas, sort of archetypal forces. So I mean, it's a shallow example, but to go back to the Airbnb situation, the idea of belonging and the idea of being anywhere, they're not simply concepts in that situation. They are forces, and one is going outwards anywhere, and the other one is coming inwards, is belonging. And so it's this, just like you have with a bow and arrow, you have the string that pulls inwards, and then you have the limbs of the bow that pushes outwards. And this is a dynamic that you get in every polar situation. There's always one that's outwards and always one that's inwards, and it's that creates the tension between them. I mean, that's what makes the sort of dynamic marriage productive in a creative context. I mean, just to go back to beauty being diversity and unity. Diversity is outwards, unity is inwards. And I thought it was interesting you saying that every brushstroke in a painting disappears into the whole. But I wonder, do they not keep their individuality at the same time? Because I think with a really great painting, you look at it and you see the whole, and then you see a part, and then you come back to the whole, and then you see another part. And so they don't lose.
There's a lot of parts that are underneath other parts. But even though they get covered up, they had their purpose before they got covered, because when they were on the canvas, they were creating a certain context, and then you're responding to that context.
Yeah.
And then even when you cover it, there's a purpose in the covering. I mean, it's almost like in scripture when it talks about all the different parts of the body, and some of them are to be honored and some of them are to be covered, hidden. And yeah, it's like that. I used to do this thing sometimes where I would go like maybe to a fundraiser or a party or something like that, and I'd have a big canvas set up, I'd have a bunch of paints, and everybody that came, I would give them a brush load of whatever color they wanted, and they would put a mark on the canvas, whatever mark they want. And I mean, it's a very interesting process, because a lot of people are terrified to even put a mark on the canvas, even if there's no consequence involved, you know.
Someone will judge you on your mark.
Yes. Yeah. But then after I got the whole canvas covered with all this chaos, then my job was to turn it into a painting before the end of the evening so that it could be auctioned off. And some people would come by afterwards and they would say, well, I like your painting, but where's my mark? I say, well, your mark had a purpose because, if you had a red mark, maybe that caused me to respond with some green over here. And
Yeah,
maybe it caused me to darken this area and lighten that area. And so every mark matters. Every
yes,
single thing matters, but they
yeah,
don't all show.
yeah. And I mean, we're so preoccupied, I think, with well, I was wondering the other day about using an illustration in a talk of having an object on a white, having the duck rabbit illusion, and saying to people, "What do you see?" And of course, what some people are going to see ducks, and some people are going to see rabbits. But then bring to the attention that nobody mentions the white space around it,
Mhm.
and yet the white space is absolutely essential for even being able to consider the question. And we're so het up on the dominant aspect of an image very often that we don't give due credit to all the parts that are the support for it. I wonder if that does that play into what you were going to say about dominance.
Well, I'm going to have to think about that for a second. But while you were talking, this picture came into my mind of many years ago. I was at a baby shower, and the game for the baby shower
Yeah,
was that we're all sitting in this room, we're at the baby shower, and a woman comes in with a tray of objects.
yeah.
She brings the tray around for each person to look at the tray, and then she goes out. And we all have a piece of paper and a pencil, and we think we're going to have to write down all the objects on the tray. But the question they asked is, uh, what was she wearing and what color were her eyes?
Not a fair. It's not a fair challenge.
Nobody got the whole picture, right?
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
so focused in on, and this is a paradigm that I think about a lot, because it's one that Owen Barfield brought up in the book Speaker's Meaning. And it
yeah,
seems to me to fit a lot of things, and that's accuracy and expression.
yeah,
And we get so focused on the accuracy, counting bits and trying to say, oh, there was a screwdriver on there, and there were three petals from a rose, and we've got all this stuff in our mind, and we miss the big picture. Just like I used to write. It took me a long time to realize that with a lot of people, I always could only see the black dot on the white paper when I looked at them.
yes,
What was the one defining feature that was driving me crazy about that person?
yeah,
Instead,
yeah.
being able to see the whole rest of the page, all the beauty that was there. And yes, there's that one little mar, but my life is all spotted too. So,
But
um,
but
but
tell me
that,
more about. I'm intrigued. I've not come across this. I, I just want to know more about what those words mean in terms of accuracy and expression.
oh,
What's he
accuracy and
getting at?
expression. Um, what was he getting at? The whole book, Speaker's Meaning, is about the idea that well, he takes 4 chapters to get there. In the end, the big story is that um, every single word is um, metaphorical before it is literal.
Yes. Yeah.
And but when he's talking about accuracy and expression, I can't remember what he meant, but what I mean when I use it
Yeah.
is that accuracy would be like the materialist reductionist view of science
Okay.
with accurate measurements, and everything
Yeah.
has to be very precise. But expression would be more like the right hemisphere of the brain with the openness and the
Yeah.
um, ability to take in the whole, and
Yeah.
these kinds of recognitions. That would be expression.
Okay.
Accuracy would be the other side of, like, quantity and quality would be that
Okay.
breakdown. So it breaks it. I find it an easy category for a lot of things, but maybe
Yeah.
maybe it's not as intuitive for other people. That's interesting.
I just wasn't sure off the bat exactly what you were meaning by those.
Well, I mean, it's
Um,
a good thing you asked me because I go around thinking, well, everybody must know what I'm thinking.
being a human being, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that's occurred to me recently is I'm part of a church, a local church, and just thinking about what makes the community work. And so often we think that it's the explicit, um, easily pointed out things that make a community work. Um, eh, Whereas it is often the white space around the object or the supporting marks in the painting that makes everything hold together. And we can give a lot of, and I'm not being down on the explicit elements of a community, but often it's we're often quite we don't easily see all the supporting stuff. And I don't mean that simply in as in all the good deeds that are going on in the background. It's just the implicit stuff, the way we relate, the how we interact with people. The At our church, there's a couple who um, the husband is brilliant at production of the church and makes everything happen, and his wife does all the refreshments, and they're absolutely fantastic at this. In turn, they'll arrive every week, be there, set up like machines, and just make a space where everyone can be. And it's so easy just to not to get used to that and then not see it. And yet I think it makes an enormous part of the experience of being there is that bit that you don't see because it's not explicit. And I suppose there's sort of tension between the balancing of that explicit and implicit elements of that situation. But it's just something that I think I'm
When you're
also
thinking of
sensitive
the
to this.
explicit, are you thinking of things like, oh, the quality of the messages and
I
the
think so.
way that
Yeah,
the
how clear the
church
message
does
was,
outreach and all of that kind of thing?
things you can clearly point to,
Hmm.
rather than the body language in conversation or the all all the things that would be right brain stuff.
Well,
Um,
I clearly remember I became a Christian when I was 32. I clearly remember walking into this church. I had been in a few churches before that, but never for any good reason. um,
mm,
and so I walked into this church, and I don't remember the message. I don't remember the music. What I remember is it seemed to be filled with light, and there were all these couples and families that clearly loved one another. And the husband had his
mm,
arm around the wife, and there was a lot of joy in that place. And that was so weird to me. I had not seen that before,
yeah,
certainly not in a church, because every other church I'd ever been in was kind of a dark place, and people sat in the back and tried to get out as soon as the thing was over. And
mm,
so to walk into a place that had that kind of an ambiance had a huge impact on me.
mm,
And I think also because the people probably reached out and were friendly, and those are things that don't come as part of the outreach package of the church, really.
yeah,
um, I think even a small thing like a clean bathroom can make a tremendous impact on a person. And who
yeah,
remembers the person who's cleaning the bathrooms? Nobody remembers that person unless they're
yeah.
not there. Right.
Yes, they just need to go on holiday every now and then for an extended time, and then everyone will appreciate them.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that one of the reasons that these things bother me is because working as a designer, um, so much of what you're doing is implicit communication. And so you get used to caring about that sort of thing. You get used to other people in a client context not seeing and not caring about that sort of thing. And so it's kind of, I mean, it'd be the same, I'm sure, with you being an artist, that it's an education in right brain, in a right brain way of approaching the world, where you begin to notice all the things that make up reality that are not the obvious ones that you can point at, and yet they're the ones that actually are the real, are really what's core to what's going on. Um, so
what,
I think
what
I'm just
what
sensitive to
occurs
that
to
reason.
me is that what you're doing when you're talking about all these corporate mottos and ways of packaging their advertising and so forth, I'm sure there's people listening. I know that there would be people who aren't listening who would be saying things like, oh yeah, you know, corporate greed and all they're interested in is selling product and blah blah blah. But what's going through my mind is that because you have in your mind a picture of how this can be used for good,
Yeah.
then the way in which you approach it, the way in which you teach other people how to do this, you can actually create an atmosphere within the companies of being concerned about the benefit to the customer and approaching it from an angle of um, well, goodness. I mean, there
Well,
just
I
seems
mean,
like so much goodness in what you're doing.
that it would be nice if that were the case. And occasionally it is the case. So much of the time, as a
That's the
designer,
goal, right?
that's the goal.
Yeah.
But so much of the time, you're working for a company that's existed for a long time. The founder has died a long time ago. It's been passed down from one person to another. They're trying to make as much money as possible for shareholders. Whoever's in the position of power is in that job for a little bit, then they will go and get another job somewhere else. It's a means to an end. And so for almost everyone there, it's a means to an end. There's very little end in itself. And so when you're brought in as a designer to update the brand or evolve the brand, it's very much a facelift without much change of character. And so if there isn't good character in the company that exists there already, there's nothing that I can do to improve that. I can give it a really good facelift, but it won't be much more than that at the end of the day. Whereas if you have a new company that started up, and it's started up by people who have a good sense of meaning, they're not materialists to the core, and so therefore they can see the value of making something meaningful and sustaining something meaningful. Then in that situation, you can help a person like that to see more clearly how to make a meaningful company. But that. There aren't a lot of those around, sadly.
Well,
Uh,
even in the other kind of a company, if you come up with a kind of a design for their logo or their motto or you know whatever you want to call it, that it has this goodness embedded in it, it's kind of like a little seed. It has to have
it's
an
something.
impact on people. I mean, some of the examples that you use in the book of other sayings like, you know, belong anywhere. You had
Yeah.
some other polarities from other companies. I can't
I
remember
mean,
it.
a famous one that's not used anymore, HSBC's, the world's local bank. But they're not using that anymore because they couldn't be true to it, and so they've had to move it on. I mean, it's a shame because it's such a brilliant expression.
Mm.
Um, and there are a number of businesses that have realized, or at least their advertising or design agencies have realized that if you bring together these opposing ideas, it'll make the brand more meaningful to customers. But underneath, but beneath the surface, there's not a lot that's changed. Um, I think that the major problem is that we're all materialists. We all think that everything ultimately comes down to particles of matter, and that there's no meaning, and we just bring meaning to the table. It's what we do as human beings, but there is no actual meaning in the universe. And so, if that is your operating system, then it's very hard to do to create or look after meaning in the world. And I think what's I've found so exciting about, or many of the discussions you're having, but the little corner of the internet discussions, and Jordan Peterson has had a huge impact on just raising conversations about the possibility that matter isn't the ultimate thing, that actually meaning is what produces the material world around us. And I think if I feel that without that paradigm shift in a person on at least some level of depth, I don't know how they could build a business that ultimately doesn't work for just material ends. I think either And maybe that could happen just at a very intuitive gut level. I think you get great leaders who sort of intuitively operate that way, even if their worldview is rather materialistic. But what I'm really keen to do is try to work with people who are coming out of that materialism, who are wanting to make meaningful businesses and therefore meaningful brands that express that the meaning of their business, and and that's where polarity can be really helpful, because I think that if ultimately everything comes down to a relationship between opposites, if all being works like that, but all meaning and all good works like that too, then if you can find the particular ideas that are in conflict in the place where you are in the work that you're doing, then you can you can be consciously making the appropriate form of good for wherever you are. And so that's a possibility. It's a very difficult possibility, but at least it's a possibility. And so that's something that really excites me.
Well, it seems like that as you're talking about polarity now, I can't remember, is it chapter 3 where you start talking about constraints? Because that's one of my favorite hobby horses too, is the whole idea of constraints. But even the whole just issue of polarity in itself is a kind of a constraint, because
yes.
if you're working on branding and you confine yourself to this polarity, then you have to dig deep to find all the meaning that's contained inside that polarity. And once you get started, you're probably not going to be able to stop. I mean, one of the first times I ever did I was taking this class where you had to do a series of 20 paintings, all of the same image in the same rectangle.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to break through, but I broke through right around maybe lesson 5 or something like that. And then the ideas started pouring out. And by the time I got to 20, I could have kept going for another 100 paintings easily. I had so many ideas, I couldn't shut off the flow. But it's because of that tight constraint, right? And I think the same thing happens when you start with a polarity, like even accuracy and expression. I started making lists of all the things that fit underneath there, and you know, it's quite extraordinary.
Well, I think it's the nature. Like freedom and constraint are a very clear polarity that we all live with, and it create. How would I say it? I think creativity always involves creativity itself is a polar dynamic, because creativity is a form of directed play, and so in play you have to have that freedom, whereas but at the same time there's going to be internal constraints within whatever game that you're playing, speaking quite broadly, and so whenever you have that opposition, that's going to be generative of something. I think McGilchrist talks about how, on your carrying the subject of constraints, how friction is required in order to move. And you think that friction is going to stop movement, but actually no, friction is what makes movement possible. And the same with freedom. You can't have freedom unless you have constraint, because it becomes you've got nothing to push off against. And so you've got that sort of inward movement of constraint with the outward movement of freedom, and it's those two things which create that energy.
Well, one of the reasons that I'm so high on this stuff is that it seems to me that, like, even that idea of McGilchrist, that without friction you can't move, that kind of a principle, if scientists took that kind of thing seriously and understood the implications of just that one thing, you can move outside of friction and understand that from many different levels. But the implication of that drives all the way down through the smallest particle and all the way out to the cosmos. I think it would change the way that they do their science. It would change the way that they come up with their theories, because I mean, it's because they run away. So the creativity being the directed play, first of all, they run away from creativity because that sort of implies there's a creative force of some sort, a creator. So they run away from that. But then the directed play aspect of it, they might be willing to look at the play, but they don't want to look at the directed side, because that
It's
also implies there's something else there, right?
well, it's the teleology, isn't it? It's the
Mhm.
purposefulness, which is, and my take on it is that it's a rather rational left brain thing that modern science has become in many ways. And one of the aspects of the left brain is that it doesn't see things in terms of purpose and teleology. And so it sees the world in terms of objects. And objects aren't by their nature purposeful. We can apply purpose to objects, and somehow we bring that to bear from somewhere. But actually, those objects are not purposeful in themselves. Whereas I think we're seeing more and more sort of right brain orientated scientists. I mean, McGilchrist is a good example of someone who is seeing the universe as having is moving towards something that at the bottom is not a material foundation, but life is the thing, and that life is something that brings forth matter. Again, on the polarity front, Coleridge sees life as that which produces unity and diversity. It's a dynamic power that produces essentially beauty, but it's the same for being. It's kind of the equation for being and the equation for beauty are the same thing. And so I think we are seeing more and more scientists who are seeing life as fundamental and life as the driving force, and that does completely change everything. It brings purpose back, it brings direction back, and therefore, as you say, it brings creativity back, which is extremely exciting. And then also you've got a situation where you can science actually then talks to art and talks to theology, because they, if life is the thing that's behind all of them, then that becomes the uniting piece of the puzzle. And then we can have discussions across boundaries in ways that we couldn't do before, which is just supremely exciting.
Yes, it is. But I've had conversations with quite a few of these people that sort of play around the edges there, but they're perfectly willing to see life as having some generative acting back on
Yeah,
the multiplicity, but they still see everything as starting from physics and making its way up, and then the cells, and then the cells join in communities, and then those communities somehow join together to make multicellular organisms.
yeah,
And then the only way that life occurs is this sort of building up, building up, building up until you get life, and then life can act back, and
yes,
then life can have purpose.
yeah,
And so they're talking about that more now than they used to, but they still see everything as coming from the bottom up.
yeah,
And the more that I've thought about it, I don't understand, like when two humans come together, and you have the sperm and the egg, and the sperm and the egg forms a zygote. The entire human is contained in that zygote. An
yeah,
entire human being, the whole is there. It's
yeah,
not a cluster of communities of cells. It's one cell that
yeah,
contains the whole.
yeah,
And so I don't know if I'm just not intelligent enough to see what they see, but they think that they can see a way that strictly by random chance in evolution, maybe not random. I talked to somebody. I just posted the video today of a new theory that life might arise out of harmonic resonance, like a piece of music.
yes. I saw
But
that
still,
posted.
that piece of music is responding to the relaxation of forces in the universe in such a way that it arises, but it's still all based on the laws of physics. And it still starts out with one and then moving out into cells becoming communities of cells that become like an organ within a multicellular. I mean, it's still starting from the bottom up and then having this life that comes back down. And so at least they're getting this sort of circular picture going, but it's still at bottom, it's still materialist.
Yeah.
And but I can't see it that way. I just can't see it that way. And I just wonder if it's a lack of intellect on my part, that I can't understand how these cells could be joining together to make organs and become these communities that are part of an organ, when the way that the entity is reproducing is with a male and a female coming together and forming a zygote in which the entirety is there. Did that just come along at some point in the evolutionary process, that the entirety was there? Before that, did we have little livers reproducing and hearts reproducing and then all kind of clustering together and becoming a living being? I mean, I just can't picture it. I listen to them talking and it all makes sense as they're talking about it, but then I lose the thread somehow.
Yeah. Well, I can't comment too much, being merely a graphic designer. So I find these things very interesting, but it gets to levels of complexity I just can't interact with. But I suppose I am encouraged by the fact that, again, people like McGilchrist are not seeing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's seeing, you know, he talks about the what is it, that relationships come before the things that they produce.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, and and then on the life front, there's something that Coleridge says. He's asked, what is life? And he says something along the lines of, what is not life that really is, which is a bit of an odd thing to say. But he's basically saying that, could there be anything that exists that is not in some form alive? And so even atoms and molecules and atoms and smaller than that, they have some form of life in them, because they're not built out of parts. Of what you were saying, they have a unity which is expressed through diversity. I think I could be wrong in this, but I think Goethe's science touches on this a bit. Mm-hmm. The idea that actually life is primarily a unity, which expresses itself through diversity, whereas we often think, in a very left brain way, that actually we put bits together and then we end up with something, whereas actually all of nature is a unity which just expresses itself. And this seems to be the nature of sort of organism versus mechanism. An organism is something which is a whole, and all the parts are a picture of the whole in their own particular way. Whereas in a mechanism, it's kind of a shadow of an organism, in that it has, there is a totality, and all those parts play their part in the whole. But you could swap one out for another. Or if you took a brick out of my house, the house would probably still stand. Whereas as I've discovered recently, if something goes wrong with a ligament in my knee, my whole body is compromised, because everything that the whole body is sort of interpenetrates every other part of itself. Mm-hmm. Everything is a totality. It expresses itself as diversity, not a series of bricks built together to make me. And so that totality contains the life, or is an expression of the life. But that's kind of where I run out, because I don't have the scientific understanding. I think probably like you.
I hope you put that in your book, because that was just beautiful.
I'm not sure if I can remember what I've just said.
Well, I'll have a transcript of it. I thought that was wonderful.
But I think probably like you.
Even one cell in your body goes rogue, you're ended.
Yeah. Yeah. Right? I think probably like you, working as a designer and you being an artist, we've probably seen the purpose that creates the unity of a piece so often that it seems so obvious to us.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm working really well, it's not as if I'm doing it. It's as if life is happening through me, and I'm producing something. And again, it's not me making abstract or rational decisions a lot of the time. It's something is coming into being through me. I mean, that's at the best moments. A lot of the time, I'm just trying to grind something out to meet a deadline. But when I've got time and space, I feel that process of life working through me to create something. And that seems to me to be what happens everywhere in nature. Again, going back to Coleridge, he's got a great quote that works of art, they have a life which we bring to them. But everything that's beautiful has life in it. It's either part of nature and therefore alive, or we give life to it. And so a painting is alive, a table is alive in that it has life through our conscious participation in it. And so we give it unity in diversity through our participation. And so even in human-made objects, there is still that life that comes through us. I'm rambling on now.
No, it's all making perfect sense to me. I was going to say, just this morning, I was listening to a panel discussion from 2013, I think it was, with Rupert Sheldrake and Mae-Wan and Gerald Pollack and some other alternative thinkers.
Mm.
And they were talking, there was some agreement amongst the group that basically everything has some aspect of life to it.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly when you look at an electron, what's holding that thing together? I mean, there's all that motion. So there's something there.
Yeah.
I remember seeing an illustration once that Carl Friston was doing when he was talking about how to distinguish. He's always talking about the Markov blanket and what parts are active states and what parts are I can't remember. It's two states. It's the active and the other one. But he does this illustration where he drops a droplet of ink into a glass of water and it just disperses.
Yeah.
But if you drop a drop of oil into a glass of water, it holds together.
Yes.
And life is like that. If that ink would come back up into a hole inside the glass of water, you would say, well, there's something about that ink. It must be alive somehow, right?
Yeah.
Because it's holding together. So the things that hold together do seem to have something. They have some directionality, or they have some boundary, or they have some purpose. Yes. And it does seem like there's some kind of life there. And as one of the panelists said, if there is a little bit of life everywhere, then you don't have to announce all of a sudden you found how it got in here in the first place.
Well, no, precisely. No, absolutely. But it also changes the way we think about how we live our lives, because survival is no longer the thing. Life is the thing. And so, and with survival, it's either on or off. You're alive or you're not. Whereas with life, you can have greater degrees of life. And then you can then when you get to the arts or humanities, then you're experiencing greater expressions of life. And a great piece of art is one that is more alive than one that's not. And again, alive in the way that it has the life of the creator in it that you participate in when you experience it. But it completely, it's no longer that life exists for survival, but actually survival exists for the purpose of greater expressions of life. And so when you have life at the bottom, then everything becomes meaningful. If it's not at the bottom, then it's only ever then it loses its place completely. It's as if that's the only place it should be. Yeah.
You must think about this stuff all the time.
I'm a slightly obsessive person.
So,
I'm just absolutely fascinated with getting to the bottom of things.
mhm.
And I suppose I felt that, as in many ways, the world is becoming less and less stable, and lots of the things we've taken for granted aren't holding together quite as well as we hoped. I think it's becoming more and more important to try and have a way of sense making, and so that's been a big part. So there are various times on my sort of religious faith journey where I've not found the structures that I'd relied on previously to be as solid as I thought they were. And so it's been important for me to try and get back to first principles and find out from those first principles how to build a house on a rock rather than on sand, so to speak.
Is that going to be your second book?
Got to get one done first.
Yeah. So how much more do you have to do with this book? I mean, so we've been going for an hour and a half. We've only got through 2 chapters. I hope we can do this again. Talk about the other 2 chapters.
Yeah, of course. There is more of it than that, but it's less together. So, but thank you very much for having me. It's been really, really good fun.
I'm
Hope you
just
feel the same.
I'm fascinated by the way you think about this. Well, first of all, it feels like you're a brother from another mother because we're thinking about the same things and we're both slightly obsessive about it, but maybe it's because of your graphic design background and working with clients, you have found a way to articulate it that is very clear and captures the essence in a very powerful way. And I just really encourage you to keep working on the book because I do think there's something super important there for people.
Thank you.
And I love the way you approach these questions, and you've obviously thought very deeply about it. You're taking something, you're zoning in deeply on one aspect of it.
Yeah.
I'm sort of, maybe I'm ADHD, I don't know. I'm very scattershot. I'm looking broadly across a wide range of topics and fishing out from all those topics where all these things show up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm sort of a gatherer.
Yeah.
And I haven't found a way to articulate it the way you have, but I greatly admire that, and I want to work harder at trying to do that. So
Well,
thank
you.
Thank you for making yourself known to me.
If you want, you could put links to the videos in the show notes.
Absolutely. Yes,
I've not yet made them live, which I need to get on and do, but I'll do that.
And I don't know if you would be interested in this or not. I don't know what your purpose is for writing the book. There's a guy named Stephen Talbott who is
I've reached out to him.
Well, you have.
Yes.
You know his book, Biology of Life. His website.
I read a paper of his.
Well, he's put his whole book online as he's working on it.
Yeah.
And so you can read the whole book chapter by chapter, and he's still working on it, editing as he goes, but he's made it available for people. And I'll send you the link to that.
Thank you.
But you might think about doing something like that, because I don't know if you're doing that in order to be a money-making endeavor or if you just want to get the information out there.
It's much more the latter. It's not a great time to be making money from books.
Well, I think you could probably find a better way to put it online than Stephen Talbott's website with his book is a little bit old school.
Yeah.
So it's not as easily accessible as it could be. You have to keep going back to the homepage to get to the next chapter, you know. Yeah. But it's wonderful stuff. I read it over and over again. I mean, just when I'm looking for something to read, I read it because he's got such an amazing mind.
Yes, he's very interesting. I think I read something on tensegrity or biotensegrity, which is the relationship between compression and tension within cells, and how
What's it called? Bio.
biotensegrity. So there's an architect and designer you probably know of, Buckminster Fuller,
Yes.
and he came up with this, or I think he nicked from someone else, this term tensegrity, which is building through tension as well as compression. So most houses, well, almost every building is built through primarily compression way of building, where you just bricks are put on top of each other and they compress down and that holds it together. Whereas a suspension bridge is a combination of tension of the rods and steel girders with the compression of the concrete, and it makes use of different materials properties, and what you end up having is a structure that's held together through this relationship. And he says that that bodies and cells work in the same way, and so that we tend to think of ourselves just built on top of other bones, but actually the bones are all floating, I'm told, in our body through being held together through ligaments and muscles. And so it's a very different way of something being built or held together than how we would tend to make things. Anyway, it's a bit of
and if the tension gets out of balance in the human body, one side or the other, then the bricks all get out of line.
Yes.
Then you've got problems like your knee.
I know what that's like. Yeah. You get problems everywhere.
Well, this has been
Karen,
great. Let's do
so
this
much.
again soon. This has just been fantastic. I can't wait to talk to you again.
Yes, it's a shame I can't pop over to the US.
Well, one of these days I want to get back to England. I enjoyed very much the one time that I did walk around London and went to the National Museum, and it was great.
Well, if you do, let's meet up.
Will do. Okay.
All right. Bye for now.